So the topic today is globalization, which is a short form for studying the global political economy, particularly from the from the Second World War and after. Post Second World War period is the period we are looking at. But before we look at globalization, the contemporary globalization, we need to go back in history a little bit and get a sense of where it all started. Because even though the term globalization is rather new and really came into vogue, in the past 30 years or so, it's become very prominent. But the dynamic behind it is not new. So we cannot simply say that globalization is what happened with the end of the Second World War and particularly with the globalization of capitalism and all this happening under first European and then American global dominance. Globalization has a longer history, and you can find multiple origins of globalization. As I said, one of the framing elements of my discourse is that all key concepts of today's international relations have multiple and global origins. Even though we take them as contemporary and we tend to focus on, we means the traditional literature focuses on the contemporary origin and often associate many of the trends and concepts in international relations with the rise of Europe and United States. But really this course tries to challenge that narrative and argues that most of the concepts that are fundamental to studying contemporary international relations have multiple and global origins. And they go back in history. Even though the history doesn't repeat itself, doesn't mean that certain patterns and ideas from the past have no relevance. So globalization is one of such concepts. Very fundamental, very foundational to the study of international relations today. And it's sort of is central to studying particularly the economic aspect of international relations. So in going back to the past, I think if you look at the multiple and global origins of globalization, we have to pay special emphasis on what some people call Oriental globalization, for the lack of a better word. And this globalization spans from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, although one could stretch it even further, because even though the 16th century marked the expansion and rise and expansion of European colonialism, so that put an end to the primacy of the Asian or Oriental empires like those in China, India, and Turkey. But really, these empires did not lose their prominence until the 18th century. So Oriental globalization in some ways was disrupted after 1500, but continued to have a major impact until the 18th century or so. And the European version of globalization really became salient after the 18th century. So there is an issue of periodization here, but still the main point to make here is that Oriental globalization was the result, a product of itself several regional connectivities. For example, the Eurasian Silk Road, which was from China, which linked China with Europe over the landmass of Eurasia, and then the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which was the kind of the maritime equivalent of that east-west connection or east-west connectivity. And we also had subcomponents of that. So a trade network within Southeast Asia, which was part of the Indian Ocean Network. There were trade networks in Africa. There were trade networks also in Europe in the medieval period. And of course, increasingly we see evidence that there were trade networks in the Americas, both in North America and also in South America, where the civilizations of Mayas and Incas played a prominent role. But here I want to focus on the Oriental part of it, which consisted of a series of interlinked civilizations and empires. And some of them included the Gupta Empire in India, Srivijaya in Sumatra, Tang in China, the Islamic empires, especially the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, and the Fatimid in North Africa and based in Egypt later on. And then, of course, the Chinese Song, Ming, and Qing empires. In this network, Southeast Asia, particularly Malacca, which is in Malaysia today, played an important role. And of course, there was the Mughal Empire in India, which played a very important role in connecting the East and the West, and playing a major role in trade and innovation before the Western dominance. The European powers basically defeated the Mughals. So what is interesting about this interlinked civilizations, or network of civilizations, so to speak, is that it was actually substantially pacified. There were, of course, war and conflict from time to time, but it was not total anarchic. It was not total anarchic in the sense of being always disrupted by violence and war. There was some of that in the Silk Road, the overland Silk Road, Eurasian Silk Road, but the maritime trade was surprisingly continuous, especially the Indian Ocean Trade Network was never really disrupted. And that network in particular, which went from say, Eastern Africa, Arabian Peninsula, through India to Southeast Asia to China, all the way to Japan, was surprisingly resilient and continuous and relatively open. It operated with generally peaceful environment, low transit rates, and relatively low customs duties. It was backed by sufficiently rational economic institutions, and it was also backed by innovation, especially from China and the Islamic world, as well as India. So, why this is important is because people often do not recognize the role played by Indian Ocean trade in the prosperity or in the evolution of world trade. And in a sense, when we talk about contemporary free trade, things like freedom of navigation, free trade, and we sort of give credit to the Europeans for having created the system of free trade, including, and the United States promotes free trade. But if free trade means ability of anyone to participate in trade by paying customs duty, I think there was a very powerful precedent of that in the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which was surprisingly resilient and continuous. And until it was disrupted and divided into zones of influence by European colonial powers, starting with the Portuguese in 1511, when Portuguese took over Malacca. So very important to keep that in mind, that the Indian Ocean Trade Network, much has been written about this by historians, and more research needs to be done, but it was to me a precursor to the open and free trade. The empires of China, India, and Islam played a particularly important role in this. So there are two kinds of power that one can talk about that these empires possessed, which helped or fueled this globalization. John Hobson, who is a English Canadian political scientist, has written about it in his book, The Eastern Origins of Western Civilization. He talks about extensive power and intensive power. Extensive power is the ability of a state to project its economic reach outwards, meaning projection of commercial power, of commercial influence. The Islamic empires were particularly good at that. Then there is the intensive power, when a large civilization or a state with significant capacity for innovation contributes to global economy through its innovation and ideas, but not necessarily by playing a managerial role in trade. So that's intensive power. And China was the best example of that. A lot of innovations, a lot of products that could be exported, but China itself was not the trading nation that the Muslims were. So countries and traders came to China through the tributary system, sometimes without it, traded, bought Chinese products, brought in foreign products. China was kind of the supplier here. But China itself was not managing world trade, except through the tributary system, which was kind of restrictive in many ways. Now, Muslims, on the other hand, the Islamic empires, did that. They also had their own innovations, nothing comparable to China, but they spread those innovations, including the innovations that took from China and India and other places, and they spread them throughout the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. India was kind of a bit of both. It had both intensive power and extensive power. India was very much a trading country, especially classical India. Indian traders made their presence throughout Southeast Asia, all the way to China, in Africa, as well as Arabian Peninsula. And India was also a center of innovation. The Mughal Empire, on the other hand, which was the major empire of India in the early modern period, it was not really a trading empire in the way its predecessors were, like the Guptas were, for example. Mughal Empire was kind of more of a Eurasian oriented empire. It was, of course, the Mughals came from Eurasia, from Central Asia, and they were a little bit more like the Chinese. They didn't really have the handle on maritime trade, and they were centered in Delhi, which is kind of away from the sea, just like the Chinese empire was also not on the maritime coast, but rather inland and more oriented toward the west rather than the east or south of China. But in any case, between them, Chinese, Indian, and Muslim empires played a very important role in Oriental globalization. And of course, you have to bring in Turkey as well. When the Turks defeated the Byzantines and took over Constantinople, established their empire, they played a major role as well, with a bit of both as well, like India. They were extensive as well as intensive in their power and influence as agents of globalization. So how is that different from what is happening today? If you look at globalization today, how is contemporary globalization different from Oriental or classical globalization that I just talked about? Well, today, there are some important differences between the old and the new globalization. There are some continuities, but there are some differences as well. Today, globalization is more of a market-oriented. It's more capitalist globalization. So with the rise of capitalism, globalization is basically driven by capitalist economies, not feudal economies or anything else. It's a market-driven process. A lot of globalization today is about liberalization or opening up your national economy to the global economy. Previously, countries could trade with each other without necessarily inviting foreign investment. Like now, Indians exported to China or China exported to India, but can't say the Indians will go and invest in China and set up a factory to produce their cotton. So they were opening to foreign trade, but not to foreign so-called investment. That's something new to contemporary globalization. A lot of contemporary globalization is driven by investment, including foreign direct investment and supply chains. There is a closer interlinking of national economies today, increasingly interdependent patterns of production and consumption, so supply chains, production networks, and the like, highly integrated markets, a focus on the firm rather than national economies. Again, very important. Private corporations play a very important role, a crucial role in globalization today. In the past, they did as well, but they were not those big corporations. I mean, they were individual traders, sometimes backed by the state. By the way, you can talk about the British East India Company, which was a private company that basically opened the trade route to India from Britain and was the center of a British India trade. Also was responsible for the colonization of India. But the British East India Company had to be chartered, even though it was a joint stock company with private capital. It has to be chartered by the British monarchy. It has to be sanctioned officially by the British monarchy. And same for other East India companies or other companies of that period. But today, private companies don't need that. I mean, private companies have a lot more autonomy. Corporations, they can do things on their own. Of course, they have to go abide by law. They have to register themselves and follow regulations. But they are a much more free agent than their counterparts in the past, whether they were from Europe or in Asia. So the firm is the unit of contemporary globalization rather than the state. In fact, such is the influence of multinational firms today that people talk about the end of the nation state or end of sovereignty, because these companies can operate across national frontiers with so much ease. They can transfer capital, make investments, to the extent that there has been talk about the end of the nation state, which is, by the way, overstated. The state is still there, resilient, but still the ability of the state to control commerce is much less than before, either by design, because states want to open up to the outside world, or they simply do not have the capacity to regulate the whole range of economic activities or economic flows across boundaries. But I don't believe in this idea of an end of nation state, but there has been a dilution of the territoriality of the nation state because of globalization and because of the rise of firms. And as you know, many firms today, multinational companies at the top end, have an annual turnover that is greater than the gross domestic product of many countries in the world. Companies like Google, Microsoft, or even automobile companies like Toyota, they have such a high turnover which eclipses the gross GDP of many countries in the world. So they are a major actor in today's international relations, the world politics, because of their role in globalization. And there is also a rapid diffusion of technologies in the area of information and communication. Really, you cannot talk about globalization without information and communication revolution. Now, this was, of course, there in the past, but it's all relative. I mean, we had maritime links between countries, between China and India, Southeast Asia, as I just talked about, between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. But they were slow. Even 50 years ago, communications were slow before the advent of the internet. And transport links, the containerization of ships, and the advent of jet aircraft all have made distances shrink at a rate that could not have been imagined. And that fuels globalization. Not only just the transfer of goods or services, but also tourism and spread of ideas and culture as well. So that is something distinctive about the new globalization, the communication and the information revolution. Again, it's a matter of degree, but certainly it's such a huge difference between what used to be the case even 50 years ago, that we have to take that into account as a distinctively new thing about contemporary globalization. And deregulation policies. I mean, now, of course, deregulation is not very vogue, and countries are turning protectionist in the last few years. But in the 1980s and 90s, deregulation was the name of the game. How to open up your economy, how to reduce regulation, how to promote the flow of capital. All these free trade areas, reducing customs duties, reducing the regulatory barriers so that goods and services can trade more freely. That was really seen as the pathway to globalization and prosperity. Sorry, slight interruption. So now deregulation is become very politically controversial because many Western countries, particularly Western countries, have turned off globalization. But 15, 20 years ago, that was the name of the game. Every country that wanted to become modern and wanted to deregulate and to open up their economy, there was both external pressure on them from international institutions like IMF, but also from multinational companies, because if the multinational company wanted to invest in your country, you have to open up. You have to make your rules more transparent and also reduce the number of what is called red tape, so that it will be easier for foreign countries to have trust and then foreign companies to invest in your country. So all this make it contemporary globalization different from classical globalization or Oriental globalization. Having said that, the basic idea that world distances are continuously shrinking, there is that trade and economic flows are important and important ways to prosperity remains. For example, in China's case, the Tang Dynasty is considered to be the most open dynasty of China. The Song Dynasty is considered to be the most innovative. So Song Dynasty had more so-called intensive power, a lot of innovations, but being very small, not really as open to the rest of the world as Tang Dynasty, which was very open to the rest of the world. So some of that continues. The very idea that openness is good, that openness can bring prosperity, is a fundamental aspect of globalization that is common to the past and the present. And there is another way in which classical or Oriental globalization is very relevant today. And I'll come back to that later when I talk about the future of globalization. It is possible, nobody can predict the future, but it is possible that the hallmark of Oriental globalization, that it was led by the East, not by the West. They were led by countries like China, India, and of course those days, of course, the Muslim world. But certainly China and India are two countries which could play another similar, very important, crucial, pivotal role in the new globalization of the future. And I want to come back to that in concluding this lecture today. So let's also look at some definitions of globalization that we have today after this little historical background. There is a narrow and there is a broad definition of globalization. The narrow definition focuses on economics and markets, just as I said, opening up the markets, and focusing on firms, focusing on free trade, interlinking of national economies, and diffusion of technology, communication, and transport revolution, and deregulation. So it's more of an economic-oriented or economistic definition of globalization. The broad definition sees globalization as multidimensional. So that means globalization has political aspects, social aspects, ideological aspects, security aspects, and the like. So Anthony Giddens, for example, who major intellectual of our time, a sociologist, but also wrote about globalization. So he defines globalization as the intensification of worldwide social relations, which link distant realities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away, or vice versa. Now you can see that this is not just about economics. In fact, the emphasis is on social relations. So it's much more than economics. Similarly, Robert Cox, a Marxist scholar of international relations, and he was a colleague of mine when I was teaching in Canada at York University. He defines globalization as growing connectedness and interdependence on a world scale. It is multidimensional, connectedness in politics and the organization of security, in economics and welfare, in culture, in ecology, in values of all kinds. No area of human activity is isolated, and within each area, no one is untouched by the condition and activities of others. So, very, very broad definition. Again, economics is just one element. No area of human activity is isolated. So, I would like you to keep both of them in mind, even though why it is important is because today we see a lot of concern about the future of globalization. Some people talk about the end of globalization. So the end of globalization depends really on what kind of globalization we're talking about. If you define globalization in terms of trade, I think trade has slowed down. I can talk about it a little bit more later. Maybe even investment might slow down, although it hasn't so much. But trade has certainly slowed down. But what about the rest of the things? What about tourism? What about communication? What about transport? They're not slowing down. What about diffusion of ideas? They're not slowing down. Cultural globalization. So, whether globalization is ending or slowing down or reversing depends on what do you mean by globalization. And that's why I want you to keep that in mind. Now, one of the key aspects of globalization today is not trade in the classical sense, but rather supply chains, or what we call production networks. You can get many examples of major products like airplanes or cell phones. Look at two of the most important products, most visible products of our time. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the iPhone. Look at the multiple territorial jurisdictions in which their components are produced. So production is global here. So the Dreamliner is produced in United States, different components, in Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, and several countries of the European Union. And then it's assembled. So when you fly the Dreamliner, you know that you are not flying on a particular national product. You are flying on a global product. The iPhone is also very remarkable. And here you have United States, China, Korea, Taiwan, all play an important role, and of course Europe. All play an important role in bringing together the iPhone. China is a very important part of the iPhone production network. So this is interesting because this is happening at the highest end of technology. But also there is one thing about this that is very, very important to keep in mind, because it distinguishes this kind of globalization from the globalization of the 19th century or early 20th century, which we call economic interdependence rather than globalization. When people talk about economic links, they talk about interdependence and globalization. Interdependence was the earlier term, was mainly forced through trade. So trade is basically the means to interdependence. When people talk about interdependence, the main reference point was trade. But when they talk about globalization, it's not just about trade. It's about finance. It's about production networks, supply chains. So this is another difference, another thing to keep in mind when you talk about the end of globalization. That it's not just about trade. So if you may have trade war, you may have disruption of trade by conflicts, like if a conflict breaks out in the Taiwan Straits, it will disrupt trade. And that will be costly. But when the production networks are disrupted, it will be even more costly. One of the arguments made by liberals is that economic interdependence reduces conflict, because any conflict will be mutually injurious. It will harm both sides. Now, if that is true of trade, it's even more true of production networks, because production networks means companies set up factories in different locations. So just imagine, China is beginning to do that. Now a lot of foreign countries have factories in China, like iPhone has a production facility in Shenzhen, for example. Just imagine when China goes around setting up its own factories in, say, Australia, India, and United States. Now, if there is a conflict, it will be even more disruptive. It's not just about trade. It's about also production networks. Similarly, finance. Now, in a trade war, you can move your products and, basically, you can move your ships around and cut off trade and the like. But it's very difficult to move your factories and or abandon them without suffering even greater losses. What I'm also trying to say is that if you talk about finance today, it's even more costly to break financial relationships because just look at the amount of money China invests in the United States treasury bills, trillions of dollars. Now, it fluctuates, but it could be over $2 trillion. This is China's surplus invested in American treasury bills. So, if there is a total war or conflict, what is going to happen? Is China going to withdraw all its money from the United States? Or United States going to seize that money? Not so easy. It's mutual assured destruction in the financial sense. If China pulls out all its investment, holdings, treasury bill holdings, Chinese currency will collapse because the value of Chinese currency will go down severely. If United States doesn't get those investments from China in securities, in treasury bills, United States cannot finance its debt. It will default because the Chinese treasury bills is what really been critical to financing of American debt. So forget about trade. Look at finance. It's a far more consequential relationship, which is why nobody is talking about financial sanctions on each other. And when there was a global financial crisis in 1997, but especially 2008, all countries came together. All the top economies in the world, including China and the US, and they developed responses through the mechanism of the G20, Group of 20, which was created after the 1997 economic crisis, but really was empowered significantly in the 2008 economic crisis, after the 2008 economic crisis. So globalization is therefore more multidimensional. It's not just about trade, it's about finance, production networks. And that makes it even more difficult to break. And that is the difference between globalization today and interdependence of the 19th century and the 20th century. So that brings us to looking at some of the benefits of globalization. So one benefit I just mentioned is that the interdependence caused by globalization. Again, I said globalization is a newer term which is more than just trade, whereas interdependence is an older term which refer mainly to trade. But let's look at the economic relationship under globalization. One of its benefits, just like trade, but to a greater extent today, that it reduces conflict. It doesn't make war impossible or unthinkable, but it reduces the likelihood of conflict by making war costly to both sides. So economic interdependence or globalization doesn't prevent war. You cannot say that. That's not the claim. But it simply makes war more costly so that leaders will have to think twice or many times over before they go into a war-like situation. So it makes war costly. And interdependence did that, globalization did that even more. So that's the benefit, peace and security benefit of globalization. Second, promoting economic growth, trade, and poverty alleviation. All these things are very, very important. There is a direct correlation between the growth in global trade and the growth in GDP. In fact, trade has expanded ahead of GDP since 1950. Now it is slowing down. But again, all of this is controversial. Some people would argue against it. But generally, the advocates of globalization would say one of the more powerful arguments is that countries that participate in the global economy are more likely to have faster economic growth and reduce poverty and achieve prosperity for themselves. So this is borne out by the experience of East Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. Now, of course, Hong Kong is part of China. Of course, you can look at then Southeast Asian countries, Singapore aside, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, all these countries have benefited by deregulation, opening up their economies to foreign direct investment. Sometimes probably too much, so they suffered the consequences of that in form of the 1997 financial crisis. But still, it is pretty hard to deny the fact that these countries have benefited by participating in globalization. Poverty alleviation. China is the best example of that. Millions and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in China since the opening up, the Deng Xiaoping reform. India, to a lesser extent, but still very, very significant alleviation of poverty. So you have to, the advocates of globalization say this would not have been possible under a centrally planned economy because it wasn't happening under the Maoist economy in China before Deng Xiaoping reforms or the Nehruvian economy in India until the reforms of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in early 1990s. Another benefit of globalization is, according to these advocates, it spreads good values like the importance of education. In fact, globalization is a vehicle of education. Globalization is a site of education. Many of you are here because of that. To study in a Japanese university coming from, say, China, for example, or going to the United States. This is a direct byproduct of globalization. And going beyond that, we have also spread of good values like human rights and democracy. This is political globalization, the political side of globalization, that the spread of democracy and human rights. Again, contentious. Some people think that's not what has happened, but surely the number of democracies in the world is greater, the respect for human rights around the world is greater. Despite this populist backlash, the situation of human rights and democracy is better, particularly human rights, is better in the world today than in the height of the Cold War. And you might, quarrel about what is human rights, whether it's a Western concept imposed on others. But no matter whatever definition of human rights you take, whether it's political civil liberties or economic rights, it has expanded. More and more countries have adopted human rights norms and principles and instruments. And also the value of democracy, again, with qualifications, because democracy can be abused, including in some of the so-called Western democracies. But still, to the extent that we can say that democracy is not perfect, but so is no other form of government, and democracy probably is the best imperfect form of government we have. So globalization associated with the spread of human rights and democracy. Intercultural understanding, promotion of intercultural understanding is another benefit of globalization. That sort of creates understanding. This can come through diffusion of culture, for example. Sometimes culture has its dark sides. Not all cultural values that comes from country to country are good, but the understanding of culture itself is important because it promotes what is called intercultural communication between countries, reduces mistrust, prevents what Huntington would call the clash of civilizations, and creates more cosmopolitanism, universalism, multiculturalism. Again, we have problems in many countries, ethnic conflicts, racism, but still more people know about each other's culture than ever before. And you saw a classic example of that in the Thailand's cave rescue of the 12 boys and their coach, how the whole world came together. And if you look at, if you read, been reading the traffic, the social media traffic on this, a lot of the people who are really appreciative of what is happening there are actually Westerners. They're amazed that these things are happening at a time when Western politicians are quarreling, say, between President Trump and NATO leaders, European leaders. There is a verbal war going on, so much nastiness there. Of course, the British politics is falling apart over Brexit. Here, relationship among people. These are people, technocrats, divers, managers, ordinary people who are providing support, coming together. People are flying in from other divers from several countries could fly in quickly, participate in the operation. Even Elon Musk could fly in with his tube, which he didn't get to use it. And some people criticize him for basically taking advantage of this crisis for publicity. But whatever it is, the fact is that the whole world can come together, not at the governmental level, non-governmental level. And I can guarantee you that governments may take credit that they provided support. But really, this rescue would have happened without government support. Although we have to give credit to the Thai Navy. I mean, they played a very important role. But the thing is, it's also this divers. who are private citizens. These volunteers who are private citizens. They played, and people who communicated, provided goodwill, support. That is really the brightest phase of globalization that you can think of. That this cooperation can happen, cultural understanding can happen. There's a much greater appreciation of Thai culture today because of the cave rescue, because the way the Thai people supported their people, this rescue operation, in a variety of ways, showcased very attractive part of the Thai culture, which the Western world have come to appreciate much more than before. So globalization does that, promotes cultural understanding. So moving on then, you'll find that globalization is not for everybody, and attitudes towards globalization change. And there are winners and losers, brighter and dark sides of globalization. But one of the interesting things today is that support for globalization is stronger in the non-Western countries, especially among the rising powers, than in the West. Now, this was becoming evident well before Donald Trump. People think Trump basically is the big factor, which is why globalization is losing support. Trump is not the cause of this. Trump is the consequence of this. He exploited the sentiment against globalization to gain office. But already, support for globalization was diminishing in the West, but increasing elsewhere, especially in rising powers like China and India. So there was an opinion poll done by the Pew Research group in the United States, where it asked the question, and this was before the American election in 2016 that got presidential election that got Trump elected, before that. So the question that was asked, if involvement in global economy is good, is involvement in global economy good? Well, 60% of the Chinese agreed, 52% of Indians agreed, 56% of Europeans agreed, but only 44% of Americans agreed. So support for globalization is strong in China, 60%. It's pretty strong compared to the highest among these four responding groups: Indians, Europeans, Americans, and Chinese. And why is that the case? It is the case because Chinese and Indians have benefited from globalization. So this is the best defense one can make of globalization. Now, if you say that to the Americans, especially in the Midwest, or Europe actually surprisingly supportive of globalization. Europe has other problems, anti-immigration sentiments, but economic globalization is still favored in Europe, with the exception of maybe Britain, because of Brexit. But in the European Union, especially in the key countries like Germany and France, according to this poll at least, Europeans are more supportive of globalization than even Indians, and close to the Chinese. But there are powerful arguments against globalization that you should keep in mind as well. First, widespread feeling among the critics that globalization benefits companies, corporations over workers, wealthy countries over developing nations, foreign investors over local business. So there are winners and losers in globalization. The winners are corporations, wealthy countries, foreign investors. The losers are workers, developing countries, and local businesses. Now, you have to understand that with a bit of skepticism, because some developing countries like India are very happy with globalization. But still, this is a very common standard argument of the critics, that globalization breeds inequality and produces uneven benefits. The second point then, criticism of globalization then, is inequality. So the International Forum on Globalization, which is like a citizens forum, in a report stated, and I quote, while promoters proclaim that this model, globalization, is the rising tide that will lift all boats. Citizen movements find that it is instead lifting only yachts, meaning that globalization is benefiting the rich, the kind of people that can own yachts, fancy boats, rather than all boats. So definitely among citizens, among common people, there is a stronger anti-globalization sentiment. It's nothing new, by the way. Anti-globalization protests have been going on even in the West and for a long time. So every time there is a Davos summit, World Economic Summit in Davos, every time there's a meeting of IMF, World Bank, there is a demonstration. APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, any sort of free trade organization or agreement, signing or conference of ministers negotiating free trade, there will be a bunch of people demonstrating against that because they don't like globalization, because of the inequality it creates, the uneven benefits it brings in. So that is the second criticism. The third criticism of globalization would be that economic interdependence doesn't prevent war and may create new conflicts. Now, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but the key point here is that it not only not prevents war sometimes, but may create new forms of conflict. For example, if you include economic interdependence and trade within globalization, there's always the problem of trade imbalance, trade deficits, and now this is, of course, the big thing. So when countries are trading, one country could have a trade surplus against the other. So China has a trade surplus against the United States, and or probably most of the countries in the world, and that doesn't make some of these countries happy. So trade imbalance becomes a new source of conflict. If you didn't trade with each other, or your trade was marginal, it's not a big factor. If the Sino-American trade was a total of $50 billion, this won't be an issue. But when it is $1 trillion, it is an issue. So as countries get close to each other in globalization, through globalization, these things become new sources of conflict. Another thing is technology transfer or technology theft. Now, one of the big complaints of Americans against the Chinese is that Chinese companies and Chinese government steals American technology unlawfully. It gains Chinese technology unlawfully. Now, that itself is a source of conflict. If China and United States were not, interdependent and do not deal with each other to the extent they do now, this will not be an issue. Now, one of the victims of this situation are Chinese students in the West and Chinese faculty as well, because this is a big issue in Australia now, which Chinese faculty are being accused of stealing Australian technology and giving it to the Chinese military. And in the United States, there is a move to restrict the visa of Chinese students. So all I'm saying is that globalization can create new forms of conflict. It's not just about not being able to prevent conflict, but it can add to the basket of issues that could create conflict. So that's an argument of the critiques against globalization. And finally, and this is really, there's a lot of substance to it, which is the criticism that, or the concern that globalization acts as a transmission belt for crises and conflicts, such as financial crisis, people smuggling, money laundering, and pandemics. So globalization may not create this, but it acts as a transmission belt. It spreads them faster. So pandemics, for example, in the case of the 2002 SARS crisis, 2003 SARS crisis, what happened was there was, I believe, a Chinese tourist in a Vietnamese lift caught this, and then the disease spreads to the entire, to Canada, to Singapore, and becomes almost half of the globe is very concerned about it. So tourism, and it becomes a transmission belt of these conflicts, of this pandemic. Tourism is a byproduct of globalization. Financial crisis. When the 1997 crisis happened, it started in Thailand, but quickly spread to all other countries, many other countries of Asia, including Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Korea, and the like. Even if Singapore's economy is very well managed, and Thailand's wasn't, but Singapore could not insulate itself from the contagion effect of the financial crisis. And then money laundering, people smuggling. Again, because of the advances in transport and travel, communication, is easy to launder money, it's easy to smuggle people, trafficking in women, children, all the drugs, all this becomes more and more possible, faster, more efficient, and more global. So these are some of the arguments against globalization, that its benefits are uneven, it has winners and losers, it can create new forms of conflict, and it can act as a transmission belt for crises or conflicts like financial crisis, people smuggling, money laundering, and pandemics. So these are the dark side of globalization. Overall then, this criticism of globalization has led some people to argue that we should have something called deglobalization. We have had too much globalization, we should deglobalize. So this is a kind of more radical leftist argument against globalization. People like Walden Bello, who is a Southeast Asian based in the United States, he has argued for deglobalization, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. So the idea here of deglobalization is to step back and pull back or reverse some of the excesses of globalization through regulation and government policies. So that could mean producing more for the domestic market than for exports, encouraging production of goods at the community and national level rather than through multinational corporations, supply chains, using government trade policy, including quotas and tariffs, to protect local economies so that they can compete with foreign companies and multinationals. Using policy, industrial policy, including subsidies, tariffs, to strengthen domestic manufacturing, especially in countries where domestic manufacturing has fallen because of foreign competition. Having better income redistribution policies, land redistribution policies, focusing less on growth and more on quality of life. This, by the way, is something that the Chinese government has said that they are going to do, that instead of being obsessed with the rate of growth, they will rather accept slow growth and upgrade the quality of life of the people. So there are many such policies that are being that Walden Bello recommends. Giving some other deglobalization strategies could be giving more focus on environment. So globalization, investment, economic growth should be subject to environmental regulations. More democratic discussion and choice, getting people involved rather than leaving decisions to bureaucrats or corporations. Get people and civil society involved in decisions about new investments and new industrial capacity building. Having a mixed economy where you have capital, private enterprises and state enterprises and community cooperatives, rather than opening up your economies mainly for the benefit of foreign corporations, which was what a lot of Southeast Asian countries were doing earlier. And also, another deglobalization policy that Bello advocates would be that giving global institutions like IMF and the World Bank less clout, less say over national economic policies, and therefore reduce the emphasis on free trade or fiscal responsibility and focus more on quality of life of people. So IMF is particularly controversial because of the conditionality it imposes on countries that borrow money from IMF when they face a balance of payment crisis. And the deglobalization strategy that Bellow advocates will take authority away from IMF or dilute the IMF's authority, and then get them to function within the boundaries of what is good for the country that is for the people of the country that is seeking bailout. But what is happening today? The deglobalization strategy I'm talking about is advocacy. It's not real, but it sort of tells you that there are groups of people who really think globalization has gone too far and it has to be held back. Now, they may be lucky because these sort of arguments on deglobalization were put forward after 2008 financial crisis. Now, after the election of Trump and the rise of populism, that is happening. We don't have to deglobalize through policy. That is happening because of political trends in Europe and the United States. So some people are talking about what is called end of globalization. It's no longer deglobalization. It's the end of globalization. Especially with Trump. When Trump came into office, he pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He was cutting American development aid. He doesn't want to sign any free trade agreements. And now, of course, he's imposing tariffs on both countries like China, but also his allies like Canada. So maybe deglobalization is happening by itself. But I think the idea of an end of globalization is too soon and a bit too hasty, premature to see. I think what is happening is globalization is not ending, but it's taking a new form. So we may be going to, some people call it globalization 2.0, but it's a new phase of globalization. And here there will be some interesting trends, which I'd like to put forward. One is that it may be, if not now, but in the future, led by the East rather than the West. Until now, globalization has been led by the West for the last 200, 300, 400 years maybe. But now the rise of China and others, India, other countries in Indonesia is also rising, South Korea is rising. Maybe the East will reclaim its traditional perch as the leader of globalization. So we're going back to the future a bit. It may be driven by South-South cooperation, the North-North cooperation. Now this is very interesting because a lot of the globalization or economic interdependence literature focused on North-North relations between the United States and Europe and a little bit on Australia. When it comes to the relations between North and the South, the US and Europe, on the one side vis-a-vis the third world, we call it North-South relations. Now, traditionally, North-North relations were more important to the global economy. North-South relations were less important. North-North was about trade, production networks, investment. North-South was about aid and assistance, and a little bit about also investment. But really, the focus of a global political economy or international political economy, as it's called, was the North-North relations. But today, you look at the trends. The South is on the rise. The global South share of global GDP was 1/3 in 1990, now almost 50%. It could be 57% by 2050. So the global South, the developing countries will produce more than the developed countries. They will account for a greater share, more than half of the share of the global GDP. And China and India are projected to account for much of that, 37% according to some calculations. Again, these calculations vary and you should not take them as absolute figures, but they're indicative. And this is like going back to the future in some ways, when China and India were the two largest economies of the world. Now, accompanying that is a growth of South-South trade. So South-South trade is now almost similar to North-North trade or North-South trade, almost a third, or over a quarter, not a third, over a quarter of total goods trade. And it's comparable to North-North trade. and is growing faster than North-North trade or North-South trade. So this is important. So the links are being forged among the South countries, the developing countries, at a faster rate than links between the developing countries and developed countries, or among the developed countries themselves. That creates a very different dynamic of globalization than the previous phase, where it was really driven by Western countries and their relationships. Foreign direct investment also, the global South countries or the non-Western countries here are playing a very important role, increasingly important role. Now South-South FDI flows are about a third of global flows, according to UNCTAD. The largest outward investing economies of the global South include Brazil, China, Hong Kong, which is part of China, and India, the Republic of Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Singapore, South Africa, and Taiwan. And look at this, multinational enterprises from Asian countries, developing Asia, that doesn't include Japan, became the world's largest investing group for the first time, accounting for 1/3 of the total. So including, the Greater China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, but Singapore, big player in this. Largest investing group in the world. Investments by Chinese multinational enterprises grew faster than inflows to the country. So Chinese companies invested more outside than companies outside invested in China. This is a significantly reversal of the trend and reached a high of 116 billion. China today spends more on economic infrastructure annually than North America and Western Europe combined in 2016. So if you look at these trends, you see that the world economy is changing from north-north to north-south to south-south. Now, it's not completely happened yet, and things can go wrong and can be reversed, but this trend is very indicative that if it continues, or some of it continues, this could change the face of globalization completely. So, we could have a globalization led by the East, as I mentioned. It could be driven by more South-South linkages. There will be less conditionality thanks to new institutions like Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The kind of IMF conditionality we have seen is not going to disappear completely, but it will be less likely to, conditionality will become less severe. So when China gives aid, it is not conditional on political reform, for example. So politics could be taken out of it. Even the AIIB, which is a Chinese-led but global institution really, has much less conditionality than the IMF or the Asian Development Bank. And certainly in terms of politics or fiscal reform and all these things, they are much less insistent that countries receiving loans carry out these reforms to qualify for that loan. There will be a broader agenda. Previously, globalization was driven mainly by trade or financial flows and financial flows and production networks. But today, if you look at where China's focus is a lot of it is about infrastructure. The whole Belt and Road idea is about building infrastructure. So it's about development. It's not about trade or exchange. It's about development. Because the fundamental need of a lot of these countries is to have economic development, and for that you need infrastructure. How can you participate in global trade meaningfully if you don't have infrastructure? So maybe the new globalization will focus more on development than trade, more on infrastructure than manufacturing per se, although they are linked, but it puts the sort of a horse before the cart, so to speak. That first have infrastructure, then you can have industrialization. It may be less coercive. Now, this is something one cannot say for sure. Coercive means less backed by military force. Now, China and India, they all propound the idea of non-interference, that when they give aid or investment, they don't have conditionality, that you must have democracy or human rights. And China certainly has made it very clear that it doesn't, adheres to non-interference. Now that may not last for very long when you have billions and billions of dollars invested in other countries. when the investment is at risk, there will be some kind of a temptation for interference. But I don't think it will be military interference. I mean, the Western globalization was directly backed by imperialism and coercion. I mean, again, one could go back in history and say that if you think of Western globalization, the starting point of Western globalization is when Western European countries went to first India, Latin America, the Americas, the looting of Peruvian gold or silver to finance Spain's conquest, the flow of that silver to Philippines, then to China, creating kind of a new form of globalization, and the European conquest all over the world, creating colonial empires. If modern European globalization started with that, I don't think we are going to go back to that state. Now, I'm exaggerating here. I mean, I think the European globalization had other facets as well. But it certainly had an element of coercion, and it was backed by conquest. And even in the 20th century, with American-led globalization, there were plenty of intervention and plenty of coercion. Whether it's the Middle East oil, the United States overthrowing the regime, the Mossadegh regime in Iran to gain access to Middle Eastern oil, United States supporting oppressive regimes in Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, for example, to maintain its access to oil. American interventions throughout modern history, last 100 years or more, so in Latin American, Caribbean, sometimes to gain back Latin American loans made by American banks to Latin American countries, to recover the sovereign debt that was of Latin American banks lending money to Latin American countries, and those countries defaulting on that debt, and United States using force to recover that money on behalf of American companies. Well, that was a facet of this modern globalization. I don't think that's going to come back under the new globalization. So that is not to say that China will not use force or India will not use force or a coercion. I think that will be too idealistic to make that claim, unrealistic. But certainly the scale of that coercion and the direct link between globalization and warfare is going to be less pronounced or less direct. And finally, the new globalization could be more pluralistic rather than based on one set of values. So, Western globalization was kind of, in a sense, spreading Western values. And whether democracy or human rights or whatever, that globalization involves spreading American or Western values. And those values are considered universal and superior to those of the others. Now, this globalization today that could come, globalization 2.0, led by the other countries, more by South-South linkages than North-South linkages, it could have greater scope for political and cultural diversity. So I don't see that China going to impose its culture on other countries, despite what you hear about the Confucian institutes. There's nothing compared. China, compared to the Christian missionaries who came out to convert billions and billions of people around the world. I don't think Chinese Confucian institutes are going to convert people into Confucian values or Chinese way of thinking. There's a lot of scaremongering going on about these institutes. Some of them have not been well managed, but still, it's not a platform for spreading Chinese values around the world. Certainly nowhere comparable to what happened during the period of Western dominance. So I think there will be greater respect for culture, cultural diversity, values, diversity of values, and variations in ideas and culture and values among regions, among nations. I don't see the world becoming a global village in the sense of everybody, speaking the same language, wearing the same clothes, eating McDonald's hamburgers. That's too idealistic and unrealistic a portrayal of and it's probably necessarily not a good thing because you don't want to homogenize everything. Look at the backlash against the European Union in countries like Britain or Hungary when European Union tried to impose same standards on everything. People don't like that. People like to be different. They can still cooperate. They still can come together when there is a need. Doesn't mean they all have to be alike. So the Chinese have a saying that harmony is different from sameness. There's a concept of harmony, which harmony is not being the same as sameness. You can be harmonious, but you don't have to be alike. Now, I think true meaning of universalism today is that you can find a common ground, still remain diverse, rather than everybody becomes alike. The idea of end of history, that capitalism and democracy is going to be the only ideology for the world, I think is discredited. The Francis Fukuyama idea is discredited. So, new globalization could have more respect for diversity, local identity, localization than the rampant globalization of the past. Again, some of these features that I described tell you that globalization is not over. It's just taking a new form. Again, go back to what I said also, that globalization is not just an economic thing, it's multidimensional. So maybe the economic part of globalization is slowed down in the last few years, particularly trade, doesn't mean other things have slowed down. And since globalization happens at the level of not only states or companies, but also at the level of people. That globalization has not necessarily slowed down. And new elements of globalization is coming up, including one that gives a greater role to non-Western countries. So we may see, therefore, new globalization, which will have its own problems, but doesn't mean it will, turn the clock back. That we'll go back to a fragmented sort of a world that some supporters of the liberal order fear. So that is basically what I want to talk about in terms of globalization.